The sky had been weeping all evening, heavy raindrops tumbling down onto the old railway station, drumming against the tin roof, spilling over the broken gutters, and gathering in shallow pools on the cracked stone floor. The platform smelled of rust, damp wood, and the sweet fragrance of wet earth that rose every time the storm grew heavier. Arun Menon leaned against a rusting iron pillar, his suitcase by his side, the white of his shirt now a dull gray from the rain that had caught him earlier. His train was late, over an hour late, and although he should have been restless, checking his watch every few minutes, he found himself strangely calm. He told himself it was because of the weather, because there was nothing he could do to change the railway's stubborn ways. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. This was his last evening in the small town he had grown up in, the place where people knew each other's names and the nights were filled with crickets instead of car horns. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of his new life in Mumbai, a city full of neon lights, endless crowds, and promises of money and success. Yet even as he tried to focus on the excitement ahead, a quiet ache pressed against his chest, the ache of leaving behind something invisible yet precious. As he stood there, listening to the hiss of the rain, his eyes drifted across the platform, and that was when he saw her. She was sitting alone on a wooden bench, her back straight despite the storm's weariness. A pale blue sari clung to her frame, darkened in patches where the rain had soaked through. Strands of her long black hair had escaped her braid, plastering themselves against her cheeks. She was clutching a book tightly to her chest, as though it were her only shield against the world. But what struck Arun most was not her clothes or the wetness of her hair, it was the look on her face. There was something in her eyes, something far away and heavy, as though she carried storms inside her that were fiercer than the one falling from the sky. She was not crying, not even visibly sad, but the silence that wrapped around her was louder than thunder. Arun hesitated. He had never been the sort to speak to strangers. Conversations with unknown faces usually died quickly with him. He lacked the charm, the easy smile. But tonight was different. Something about the girl, about the loneliness she carried, the way she stared past the rain as if waiting for an answer that never came, pulled him in. Before he could stop himself, he picked up his suitcase and walked closer. "Excuse me," he said, his voice soft but still jarring against the rhythm of the storm. "Do you know if the 8:15 express has been cancelled?" She looked up at once, startled out of her thoughts. Her eyes locked with his, and for the briefest of moments, Arun felt his breath stumble. They were dark eyes, lined with fatigue, but not defeated, eyes that had seen too much and yet still refused to bow. She blinked, and after a pause, spoke. "It's delayed," she said, her voice quiet, almost musical in its softness. "Not cancelled. At least, that's what the station master told me." Arun nodded quickly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "These trains," he muttered, "always late when you need them the most." A small smile curved her lips then, faint but noticeable, as though she hadn't smiled in a long time and was only just remembering how. "Yes," she replied. "Always late, always testing patience. Maybe it's life's way of teaching us to wait." Her words caught Arun off guard. They were not casual, not the meaningless small talk of strangers. They carried depth, like she had learned them the hard way. He found himself intrigued, though he wasn't sure what to say in return. Finally, almost without thinking, he lowered his suitcase and sat down at the far end of the bench. For several minutes, the two of them sat in silence. The rain filled the space between their unspoken words. Arun tried not to stare, but his eyes kept wandering to the book she held. The cover was damp, corners curling, the letters blurred by stray drops. He leaned slightly forward. "What are you reading?" he asked. She lifted it carefully, as if embarrassed to show the damage. "The Alchemist," she said. Arun smiled. "A story about destiny." Her lips twitched with the beginnings of another smile. "Or about chasing dreams." They looked at each other then, properly, for the first time. It wasn't a long stare, not the kind filled with dramatic sparks that movies love to show. It was brief, quiet, but it warmed something in Arun's chest. He didn't know why. He didn't know how. But for that single moment, with the storm raging outside, the railway station seemed less lonely. "My name's Arun," he said finally, almost too quickly. "I'm going to Mumbai." She hesitated, as though debating whether to share anything at all. Then she said, "Meera." "I'm going to Pune." "Work?" he asked. "Not exactly." Her gaze shifted back to the rain. "More like, starting over." Arun wanted to ask what she meant, what she was leaving behind, but something in her tone told him not to. Instead, he let the question hang unspoken between them, carried away by the patter of the rain. The loudspeakers crackled then, announcing another delayed arrival. Arun groaned softly and checked his ticket. Still time. He turned back to her. "You know," he said, half joking, "maybe this delay isn't such a bad thing after all." She raised an eyebrow, curiosity flickering across her face. "Why do you say that?" He looked at her for a moment, his own boldness surprising him. "Because sometimes, life gives us delays so we can meet the right people." For a second, neither of them spoke. The storm outside roared. A faint blush touched her cheeks, and she quickly looked away, adjusting her book as though it suddenly needed her full attention. Arun smiled to himself. The train had not yet arrived. But deep down, he knew, something else had. The train finally arrived an hour later, its horn echoing through the wet night as steam and rain mingled in the air. People rushed across the platform, pulling luggage, shouting at porters, hurrying into compartments before the storm grew wilder. Arun lifted his suitcase, sparing a final glance at the girl beside him, Meera, half expecting she would disappear into the crowd without another word. But fate had a different plan. When Arun climbed into his reserved coach, dragging his suitcase along the narrow aisle, he froze. There she was again, struggling to push her bag onto the upper rack. For a moment, Arun thought the universe was playing tricks on him. Then, almost instinctively, he moved forward. "Here," he said, reaching for her suitcase before she could protest. He pushed it up easily, slotting it into place. Meera looked at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. Then, after a pause, she whispered, "Thank you." Arun smiled. Looks like the delay wasn't the only coincidence tonight. They shared a small laugh, awkward but genuine. And when the train jolted forward, pulling out of the station, their journey together truly began. The rain chased the train through the night, droplets racing down the glass like falling stars. The compartment was quiet except for the soft murmur of other passengers. Arun and Meera sat across from each other, separated by the narrow aisle but drawn into conversation as though the storm outside had erased the boundaries between strangers. At first, it was small talk. The usual, where they were from, what they did, what they hoped to do. Arun spoke about his job offer in Mumbai, about leaving behind his hometown with both excitement and dread. Meera listened, nodding, sometimes smiling, though her eyes always seemed to hide something. When he asked about her, she hesitated again. "I studied literature," she finally said. "But I'm not working right now. Pune is a chance for me to start fresh." "Start fresh?" Arun tilted his head. "That sounds like a story." Meera's lips curved faintly, though her eyes grew distant. "Maybe one day, I'll tell it." Arun didn't push. He sensed her walls, strong but fragile, and he knew better than to try and climb them too soon. Instead, he changed the subject. Hours slipped by. They talked about books and movies, about how the world always seemed too big for dreamers and too small for those who stopped dreaming. They laughed at small things, the tea vendor's endless calls of chai. Garam chai, the way the old man snored 2 berths away, the strange smell of wet samosas someone had brought aboard. For Arun, laughter came easily that night, something he hadn't felt in weeks. He realized that Meera had a way of listening that made even his smallest stories sound important, as though she was storing them carefully in some hidden part of her heart. And Meera, though quiet at first, found herself speaking more than she intended. There was something about Arun, his straightforwardness, his unpolished honesty, that made her want to trust him, even against her better judgment. At one point, the lights flickered, the compartment plunging into near darkness for a moment before recovering. Meera tensed, her hands clutching her book tightly. Arun noticed. "Are you afraid of the dark?" he asked gently. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "Not the dark. Just losing control." Arun wanted to ask more, but the words hung heavy, and he let them go. He leaned back, watching her silhouette against the dim light. He wondered what battles she was fighting, what shadows lingered behind her calm face. The train raced on through the night, cutting across fields and rivers hidden by the rain. And though neither of them admitted it aloud, the silence between Arun and Meera no longer felt like the silence of strangers. It felt like the comfort of two people who had known each other longer than a single evening. Near midnight, most of the compartment was asleep. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was the only sound. Arun found himself still awake, staring at the ceiling, thoughts buzzing too loudly to let him rest. He turned his head and found Meera awake too, gazing out of the window. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. She didn't look at him, her voice just above a whisper. "That life is strange. You can spend years knowing people and still feel like a stranger to them. And then, one night, in the middle of a storm, on a train, you meet someone who feels familiar in ways you can't explain." Arun's chest tightened. He wanted to say something back, something profound. But the words stuck in his throat. All he could do was watch her, the glow of the night lamp softening the lines of her face, and wonder what it meant that she felt that way about him. The train rattled on into the dark. Outside, the rain had finally begun to ease, leaving only the steady hum of the wheels against the track. Inside, Arun and Meera drifted into silence once more, but it was no longer awkward. It was the silence of something fragile, something new, quietly taking root between them. By the time dawn approached, the rain had stopped. The first faint rays of sunlight painted the horizon in shades of gold. Arun sat up, rubbing his eyes, and caught Meera still half asleep, her head resting lightly against the window, the book slipping from her lap. He thought about waking her, but stopped. Instead, he watched her for a moment, memorizing the softness of that quiet morning, the way the world outside seemed to slow down around her. And in that stillness, one truth settled in his heart. Whatever their journeys ahead, this was not a meeting he could ever forget. The train screeched into Pune station just as the morning sun spilled across the city, lighting up the platforms crowded with vendors and passengers. Arun helped Meera with her bag, lowering it from the rack with ease. She smiled in thanks, her hair falling across her face as she adjusted her sari. "This is me," she said softly, as the train slowed to a stop. Arun nodded, but something inside him twisted. He had known, of course, that their journey together would end here. And yet, he wasn't ready to let it. Meera picked up her book, her fingers lingering on the damp cover, then looked at him with a hesitation he had already begun to recognize in her. "It was nice talking to you." "Nice?" Arun repeated, smiling despite the heaviness in his chest. "That's all?" For the first time, she laughed, a real, unguarded laugh. "It was more than nice," she admitted. Then, after a pause, maybe, it was needed. The train had stopped fully now. People were rushing to get off, calling for coolies, dragging luggage across the platform. Meera stepped toward the door, then glanced back at him once more. "Goodbye, Arun." He opened his mouth to reply, but the words stuck. By the time he found them, she had already stepped into the crowd, her blue sari vanishing among the hundreds of strangers. The train rolled on toward Mumbai, but Arun's thoughts stayed behind in Pune. He leaned against the window, watching the scenery blur past, and wondered why it felt as though he had left something unfinished, something important. He told himself it was foolish. He had met Meera only once, shared a few hours on a train. People came and went in life all the time. But still, her words lingered, echoing in the quiet corners of his mind. Sometimes, you meet someone who feels familiar in ways you can't explain. And that night, lying in his rented apartment in Mumbai, surrounded by the distant roar of traffic, Arun closed his eyes and realized he was listening for a voice that wasn't there. Life in Mumbai moved quickly. Days blurred into weeks as Arun settled into his job, long hours at the office swallowing most of his energy. The city was everything he expected, loud, relentless, alive at all hours. Yet beneath the noise, there was a silence only he seemed to hear, a hollowness he couldn't quite fill. He thought of Meera often, though he told no one. He thought of the way she had clutched her book like a shield, the way her smile had started small but bloomed brighter when she forgot to guard it. He thought of her laugh, soft but genuine, like the first drop of rain after a long drought. And though he had her name, he had nothing else, no phone number, no address, not even a promise of meeting again. She was a stranger. And yet, she wasn't. Meanwhile, in Pune, Meera's new life unfolded with equal intensity. She had moved into a small apartment near the university, taken a position as a part-time literature tutor, and thrown herself into routines that left her little time to think. But at night, when the city quieted and she was left alone with her thoughts, she found herself remembering the boy on the train, the way his words had carried warmth, the way his honesty had made her feel seen in a world that often looked past her. She reminded herself it was only chance, a fleeting encounter. She had left behind too much, carried too many scars to believe in accidents of fate. And yet, sometimes, when the rain fell heavy against her window, she caught herself wondering if he was listening to the same storm in Mumbai. Months passed. One evening, Arun was walking back from work when he heard a familiar voice behind him. At first, he thought he had imagined it, the mind's cruel trick. But when he turned, his heart lurched. Meera. She was standing across the street, holding a stack of books, her blue dupatta fluttering in the breeze. She looked exactly as he remembered, and yet different, stronger, perhaps, or maybe just more real outside the dream of a train ride. Meera, he called, disbelief coloring his voice. Her eyes widened. For a second, she froze. Then, slowly, she crossed the street. Arun, she whispered, as though testing the sound of his name on her lips. For a moment, the noise of Mumbai, the honking cars, the vendors shouting, the endless rush of footsteps, faded. It was just the two of them, standing in the middle of the crowd, staring at each other as though they had been pulled together by invisible threads. "You're here," Arun said, almost laughing in wonder. "In Mumbai?" She nodded, smiling faintly. "Only for a seminar at the university." "I didn't expect," she trailed off, shaking her head. "I didn't expect to see you." "Neither did I," he admitted. Then, unable to stop himself, Can we sit somewhere? Just talk, like before?" Meera hesitated. She had promised herself she wouldn't blur the lines between chance and choice, that she wouldn't step into something she wasn't ready for. But looking at him, at the earnest hope in his eyes, she found her resistance slipping. "All right," she said softly. And just like that, the distance between them began to shrink. They sat in a small cafe near the station, the kind with plastic chairs and chipped tables but tea that steamed with the smell of cardamom. Hours passed as they talked, about work, about the city, about everything and nothing at all. Arun found himself telling her things he hadn't told anyone else, and Meera, despite her guarded nature, let her laughter return, brighter than before. But beneath it all, there was an unspoken question: what happens next? When the evening ended, when she would return to Pune and he to Mumbai, would this be another goodbye? Arun walked her back to the station, the air heavy with words they didn't say. Finally, as the announcement called her train, he looked at her and said quietly, "I don't want this to be just another coincidence, Meera. I don't want to lose this again." Meera's heart clenched. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe in the possibility of something more. But her past, her fears, the weight of everything she was running from, all of it held her back. "Arun," she whispered, "sometimes life doesn't let us choose." Then, before he could reply, she turned and stepped onto the train. He stood there, watching as the train carried her away once again, the words he wanted to say trapped in his chest. But this time, he knew. This wasn't the end. The days after their second meeting stretched long and heavy. Arun tried to return to his routine, early mornings, the crowded local train, endless hours in the office, late dinners of street food eaten in silence. But something had shifted. Every chai stall reminded him of their conversation in the cafe, every passing face on the station platform made him glance twice, hoping against reason that it might be her again. He replayed her words over and over, "Sometimes life doesn't let us choose." Why had she said that? What chains held her back? The questions haunted him more than the absence of answers. In Pune, Meera buried herself in work. Her students adored her, calling her Meera Didi, clinging to her stories of poetry and novels that carried them into worlds far brighter than the one outside their windows. She smiled for them, laughed even, but when the day ended and the classroom emptied, she sat alone with her thoughts. Her landlord often saw her sitting by the window, chin resting on her palm, staring at the rain as though waiting for someone who never came. She told herself she was being foolish. Arun was a stranger, someone she barely knew. And yet, his presence clung to her like the faint trace of perfume on a scarf, impossible to shake off. One evening, unable to resist the pull any longer, Arun searched. He didn't know her last name, didn't know where she lived, but he remembered the book she had been holding on the train, an old, second-hand copy of Wuthering Heights, its cover torn. He went from one second-hand bookshop to another, asking if anyone had sold such a copy recently. The shopkeepers shook their heads, some laughed, some ignored him. It was a hopeless attempt, and yet, he couldn't stop. "Bia," one old bookseller finally said, "people come and go. Books pass through many hands. Maybe it's not the book you should be chasing." Arun walked home that night under a sky heavy with monsoon clouds, wondering if the man was right. But deep inside, he knew, he wasn't chasing a book. He was chasing the person who had taught him how much a single meeting could matter. Meera, meanwhile, was fighting her own battles. Her past lingered like a shadow she couldn't escape. She had once been engaged, to a man her family chose, a man who wore charm like a mask but revealed cruelty when no one was watching. Breaking the engagement had taken all her strength, and the scars it left were not easily healed. Love, to her, was a word wrapped in fear. And yet, with Arun, something inside her stirred, a warmth she had believed dead. That was why she ran, why she told herself they couldn't choose. Because choice meant risk, and she had already bled too much. But at night, lying awake, she thought of him. His voice. His smile. The way he had looked at her, not as if she were broken, but as if she were whole. And it scared her more than anything. Months passed, but fate was not finished with them. One rainy evening in Mumbai, Arun was caught in a downpour outside the office. He ducked into a small roadside bookshop to wait for the storm to ease. Water dripped from his hair as he browsed aimlessly through the shelves. His hand reached out to pick a book, when suddenly, he froze. It was Wuthering Heights. The same torn cover. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at it. Then, with shaking hands, he picked it up. Inside, on the first page, written in neat blue ink, were two words, Meera Joshi. His heart slammed against his ribs. At last, he had her name. That night, Arun barely slept. He searched for her online, typed her name into every corner of the internet he could reach. There were too many Meera Joshis, but after hours of searching, he found her, an article from a local university blog, praising a young literature tutor for her work with underprivileged students in Pune. Her photograph stared back at him from the screen. It was her. Arun leaned back in his chair, breathless, the city buzzing beyond his window. He finally had a path to her. But now came the real question, should he follow it? Because love, he knew, was not just about finding someone. It was about being found in return. Arun stared at the screen long after her photograph had disappeared into the dim light of his computer. The article about Meera Joshi was short, just a few lines praising her teaching, a grainy picture of her standing with a group of smiling children. But to him, it felt like a window had opened, one that fate had stubbornly kept shut for months. He whispered her name, testing it on his tongue. Meera Joshi. It felt right, like a secret he had finally unlocked. For 2 days he hesitated, unsure what to do. He typed and erased messages, scrolled through the university's contact page, then shut his laptop in frustration. What if she thought him a stalker? What if she had moved on, forgotten him, lived peacefully without needing his presence to disturb her balance? But then came the night of the storm. The rain hammered against the window of his flat, the electricity flickered, and the loneliness of the city pressed in on him like a second skin. He sat at his desk, pulled a piece of paper from his drawer, and began to write, not an email, not a text, but a letter. Dear Meera, I don't know if you will remember me. We met on a train, and again by chance in a small cafe. Twice is not much, but it was enough to leave me wondering if the universe had something to say. If this reaches you, forgive me if I have crossed a line. I only wanted to ask, are you well? Are you happy? Yours sincerely, Arun Menon. He sealed the envelope and held it for a long time, unsure if he had the courage to send it. But the next morning, with rain still falling, he walked to the post office and dropped it into the red box. His hands trembled as the letter disappeared into its mouth. It was done. In Pune, Meera's days continued in quiet rhythm, classes, laughter of children, the solitude of evenings. When the letter arrived a week later, she almost didn't open it. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar, and for a moment she feared it was from her past, from the man she had escaped. But as soon as she read the first line, her heart skipped. Arun. Her hands shook as she read his words again and again. Simple, respectful, careful, as if he feared breaking something fragile. He had not demanded anything, not declared love or longing. He had only asked if she was well. It should have been easy to ignore. Yet that night, she found herself sitting by the window, pen in hand, staring at a blank sheet of paper. Finally, she began to write. Dear Arun. Yes, I remember you. How could I not? Some meetings are brief, but they leave a mark that time cannot erase. I am, well. At least, I am trying to be. Thank you for asking. And you? Do you still believe delays in life are meant for something? Warm regards. Meera. She folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and sealed it with a sigh. As she dropped it into the postbox the next day, her heart raced in a way it hadn't in years. And so began the letters. One after another, words traveled between Mumbai and Pune, carried not by the speed of phones or emails but by the slow rhythm of ink and paper. Arun wrote about his office life, his love for books, his small struggles and small joys. Meera replied with stories of her students, her favorite poems, the way the rain always reminded her of unfinished things. Sometimes their letters were long, filled with pages of thought. Sometimes they were short, a few lines that said more in their silences than in their words. With every letter, the distance between them seemed to shrink. And yet, something unspoken hung in the air. Meera never told him the truth of her past, the wound that made her afraid to reach out fully. Arun never confessed how much he longed to see her again, to hear her voice outside of memory. It was as though both of them stood at the edge of a river, throwing words across but never daring to cross themselves. One evening, as Meera folded his latest letter, she caught herself smiling without realizing it. A student passing by her door saw her and teased, "Didi, are you in love?" Meera laughed it off, but when she closed the door behind her, the question lingered. Was she? She shook her head. Love was dangerous, love was fragile, love was what had once almost broken her. And yet, there was no denying it. Arun's presence in her life, even through paper and ink, had begun to heal something inside her she thought would never mend. Arun, too, felt the pull growing stronger. One evening, after rereading her letter for the 5th time, he whispered to himself, "This isn't enough anymore. I need to see her." But he hesitated, because to take one step closer might mean pushing her away forever. And so, the letters continued, each one carrying hope, fear, and a weight of silence too heavy for ink alone to bear. The pile of letters sat on Arun's desk like a secret treasure. Dozens of envelopes, each in Meera's careful handwriting, tied together with a simple red ribbon. He often reread them late at night, when the city had gone quiet, when the loneliness of his flat pressed in like a heavy curtain. But lately, even those letters weren't enough. They brought her closer, yes, but they also reminded him how far away she still was. Ink on paper could only travel so far. What he wanted was her voice, her laughter, the way her eyes softened when she let her guard down. One Sunday evening, as rain beat against the window again, Arun stood in front of the mirror. His reflection looked restless, tired, but determined. He whispered aloud, as if trying to convince himself. I have to see her. The decision was reckless, maybe even foolish, but once it lodged itself in his mind, it wouldn't leave. He booked a train ticket to Pune. The morning of his journey, he carried no suitcase, only a small satchel with a notebook, a pen, and the bundle of her letters. The platform in Mumbai was crowded as always, voices and footsteps blending into a restless hum. But Arun felt strangely calm. As the train pulled out of the station, he leaned back in his seat, imagining her expression when she saw him. Would she be happy? Surprised? Or would she turn cold, accuse him of crossing boundaries? The thought twisted in his chest, but he knew he had to try. The scenery rushed past the window, green fields, sleepy villages, clouds rolling heavy with monsoon rain. Each mile brought him closer, but also filled him with a gnawing uncertainty. Meanwhile, in Pune, Meera sat at her desk, grading her students' essays. She paused, tapping her pen against the paper, her mind wandering as it often did these days. She thought of Arun, his gentle handwriting, his questions, his silences that seemed to understand hers. She wondered what he was doing at that very moment. Was he writing another letter? Was he thinking of her? A sudden knock on the door startled her. It was her landlord's daughter, holding out a fresh bundle of letters. Post came for you, Didi, she said with a grin. Meera smiled, thanked her, and closed the door. But her smile faded when she saw there was no new letter from Arun this time. Only official papers, bills, things that held no warmth. She felt an unexpected sting of disappointment. She had grown used to his rhythm, his words arriving like the steady beat of rain. Without them, the day felt incomplete. She didn't know that, even as she held that empty bundle, Arun's train was already rushing toward her. When he arrived in Pune, the sky was gray, and the air smelled of rain. Arun stepped onto the platform, his heart thundering louder than the train's. He had no address, no map, only the name of the university Meera had been mentioned in online. It was reckless, but he trusted his instinct, the same instinct that had led him to pick up that torn copy of Wuthering Heights. He hailed a rickshaw and asked to be taken to the campus. The ride was bumpy, weaving through narrow lanes crowded with tea stalls, fruit vendors, and children splashing barefoot in puddles. Every face he passed made his pulse quicken, as if she might appear at any moment. Finally, the rickshaw pulled up at the university gates. Arun paid the driver, then stood frozen for a moment, staring at the entrance. His palms were slick with sweat, his throat dry. What if she wasn't here? What if she refused to see him? Still, he forced himself forward. Inside the campus, a group of children ran past, clutching notebooks and laughing. Arun stopped one of them, a boy with ink-stained fingers. Excuse me, Arun said gently. Do you know a teacher named Meera Joshi? The boy's face lit up. Of course. Meera Didi. She teaches us poetry. The words filled Arun with warmth, but also with fear. She was real here, not just in his imagination. Real, and beloved by others. The boy pointed toward a small classroom at the far end of the courtyard. She's there. But hurry, class is almost over. Arun nodded, thanked him, and walked toward the room, each step heavier than the last. Through the doorway, he saw her. She stood at the blackboard, chalk in hand, her sari draped simply, her hair tied back. She was reading aloud a verse of poetry, her voice carrying softly, filling the room like music. The children watched her with rapt attention. Arun's breath caught. Months of letters, memories, silences, none of it compared to this. to simply seeing her again. He leaned against the doorframe, unnoticed, and let himself listen. When the bell rang and the children rushed out, Meera turned, gathering her books. That's when she saw him. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her face. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Arun," she whispered, as if speaking his name might break the fragile air between them. He took a hesitant step forward. "Hi, Meera." His voice was rough, almost trembling. I had to see you." Her fingers tightened around the chalk she still held, her chest rising and falling too quickly. She looked torn, between relief and fear, between longing and the instinct to run. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why did you come?" Arun swallowed hard, searching for the right words. "Because letters aren't enough anymore. Because every time I wrote to you, I wanted to hear your voice. And because," he stopped, the words catching in his throat. "Because I can't stop thinking of you." Silence hung heavy. Meera's eyes glistened, but she quickly turned away, setting her books down with shaking hands. "You shouldn't have come," she said. "You don't know what you're asking for." Arun stepped closer, his voice low, urgent. "Then tell me. Help me understand. Please." Her back stiffened. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly, she turned to face him, her eyes clouded with shadows. "You don't know my past, Arun," she whispered. "If you did, you wouldn't be standing here." The classroom was silent, save for the faint patter of rain against the window. Arun stood in the doorway, his heart pounding, waiting for Meera to speak. She looked fragile yet fierce, her hands clenched around the edge of the desk as though it was the only thing keeping her steady. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Arun thought she might walk away, leave him standing there with questions he had no right to ask. But then she drew a shaky breath, and her eyes, dark, storm-filled, met his. "You want to know why I told you once that life doesn't let us choose?" she asked softly. Arun nodded. Her lips trembled, but she forced herself to continue. "Because I once thought I had a choice. I once thought I could build a life on my own terms. And I was wrong." She turned away, her voice breaking slightly. 3 years ago, my family arranged my engagement. He was a businessman, wealthy, polished, perfect in everyone's eyes. At first, I tried to believe it would work. That love could be built, even if it wasn't born. Arun's hands curled into fists, sensing what was coming. Meera's voice grew quieter, as though the memories themselves were heavy on her tongue. But behind closed doors, he was different. Controlling. Cruel. He treated me like a possession, not a person. If I questioned him, he grew angry. If I resisted, he reminded me how powerless I was. Her breath shook. One night, he raised his hand. That was when I finally realized what kind of life awaited me if I stayed. So I left. I broke the engagement. My family, they didn't forgive me. They said I shamed them, that no good man would ever accept me now. And maybe they were right. Because since then, I've lived in the shadow of that choice, free, but alone. Arun's chest ached as he listened. His mind filled with the image of her sitting by her window, staring at the rain, not waiting for someone, but haunted by what she had escaped. Meera's voice cracked as she whispered, "Do you see now? Do you see why I told you we cannot choose? Because I chose once, and it almost destroyed me. I cannot risk it again. Not with you. Not with anyone." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "That is my past, Arun. Now tell me, knowing this, do you still want to stand here?" Arun took a step forward. He wanted to reach for her, to take her trembling hands into his. But he stopped himself, afraid she would retreat if he moved too quickly. "Meera," he said, his voice low, steady despite the storm in his chest. "I don't care about what your family said. I don't care about what he did. What I care about is who you are now. The woman who teaches children to dream. The woman who sees beauty in rain, even when it reminds her of sorrow. The woman who, he hesitated, then finished softly, the woman who changed my life with nothing more than a smile on a train. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I'm not asking you to forget your past, Arun continued. I know those scars won't vanish because I showed up at your door. I'm only asking you to let me stand beside you while you carry them. To give us a chance. The silence stretched, heavy with her hesitation. Finally, she shook her head, stepping back. You don't understand. Loving me means inheriting my shadows. And I won't let you carry that burden. Her voice was breaking, yet her resolve was firm. Please, Arun. Go back to Mumbai. Forget me. It's better this way. For the first time since their letters began, Arun felt truly powerless. He wanted to argue, to promise her that nothing could drive him away. But looking at her, the fear in her eyes, the tightness in her shoulders, he realized pushing now would only make her walls higher. So he took a deep breath, forced himself to nod. If that's what you want. Meera's lips trembled. She didn't answer. Arun turned and walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last. At the threshold, he paused, his back still to her. His voice was quiet but steady. I can go back to Mumbai. I can even stay away, if that's what you want. But forget you, Meera. That's the one thing I'll never be able to do. And then he walked out, leaving her alone in the classroom with her ghosts. That night, Meera sat by her window again, the same place she always ended her days. But this time, she held something in her hands, one of his letters. She read it under the dim light, her tears blurring the ink. He had written about hope, about the possibility of beginnings, about how some delays were blessings in disguise. Her heart ached. For the first time in years, she wished her past hadn't stolen her courage. Because in another world, she would have run after him, stopped him before he left the classroom. In another world, she would have chosen differently. But in this one, she only whispered his name into the rain. Arun. Mumbai had never felt lonelier. Arun returned to the city with an emptiness he couldn't shake, as though he had left something behind in Pune, not just Meera, but a part of himself. The office work that once distracted him now felt suffocating. The crowded trains, the endless noise, the neon lights, all of it seemed hollow. Even his letters, once his only solace, felt useless now. His pen hovered over the paper, but no words came. What could he write, when she had asked him to let her go? And yet, each evening he found himself at his desk, staring at her old letters, tracing the ink of her handwriting with trembling fingers. He whispered to the silence, I can't forget you, Meera. I can't. In Pune, Meera lived in equal torment. She tried to bury herself in her students' laughter, in her books, in her work. Outwardly, she was the same gentle teacher everyone adored. But inside, a storm churned. She had told Arun to forget her, to leave her behind. And he had obeyed. That should have brought her peace. Instead, it hollowed her. The classroom felt colder, the rain lonelier, the nights longer. She missed his letters. Missed his words, his questions, his quiet understanding. She missed him. But with the ache came fear. Fear that if she reached for him, history would repeat itself. That she would once again be hurt, or worse, drag someone else into the shadow of her scars. So she told herself she had done the right thing. Yet every night, when she closed her eyes, she saw him walking away from her classroom door. And the sound of his last words haunted her. Forget you? That's the one thing I'll never be able to do. Weeks passed in this unbearable silence. One evening, while Arun sat on the edge of his bed, staring at her last letter, his phone rang. He almost ignored it, until he saw the caller ID. Unknown number. He answered. Hello? For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a voice he knew by heart. Arun. He froze. His breath caught in his chest. Meera? Her voice trembled. I shouldn't be calling. I told you to stay away. But, her words broke. I can't do it. I thought I could live without you. I thought pushing you away would protect us both. But I was wrong. Arun closed his eyes, relief flooding through him. He pressed the phone tighter to his ear. Meera, you don't have to explain. You don't have to be afraid. I told you, I don't want you without your past. I want you with all of it. All of you. A sob escaped her throat. And if I break you like he almost broke me? You won't, Arun said firmly. Because you're not him. And I'm not afraid of shadows, Meera. I've lived long enough in emptiness. I'd rather live with your storms than with anyone else's silence. Her breath hitched. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of years and fears pressing heavy between them. Then Meera whispered, "Do you still have my letters?" Arun smiled faintly. Every single one. Then maybe, she said softly, you can come to Pune again. Not tomorrow. Not next week. But soon. Because if I'm going to find the courage to choose again, I think it has to be with you. That night, after the call ended, Arun sat in the dark, his heart racing with a hope he hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time, the city lights outside his window seemed less harsh, almost gentle. He picked up his pen and wrote her a letter. Dear Meera. I don't know when I will see you again, but I will wait, for as long as it takes. Not because I expect you to choose me, but because I believe you deserve the freedom to choose without fear. And if that choice someday is me, then every delay, every silence, will have been worth it. Yours always. Arun. He sealed it with steady hands, knowing this letter carried not desperation, but patience. Meera received it days later. She sat by her window, reading it over and over, tears slipping down her cheeks. For the first time, they were not tears of fear, but of release. She whispered into the quiet room, maybe it's time to stop running. The monsoon was almost over when Arun finally returned to Pune. He hadn't told Meera he was coming. He hadn't even written beforehand. But something inside him, something stronger than fear, drove him back to the city where their story had begun. The streets were damp with the season's last rain, the smell of wet earth heavy in the air. Arun walked the familiar road toward the school, his heart pounding with every step. He wondered if she would be there. Wondered if she would even want to see him. When he reached the gates, the schoolyard was alive with children. Their laughter echoed like music. And then, through the noise, he saw her. Meera stood beneath the neem tree, books in hand, watching over her students with the same soft patience he remembered. Time seemed to pause. Her hair, loose around her shoulders, swayed in the breeze. Her eyes, though tired, still carried that quiet fire. Arun didn't move at first. He simply stood, afraid that if he stepped closer, the vision might dissolve. But then Meera looked up. Their eyes met across the distance. And she smiled. It wasn't the polite smile of a teacher. It wasn't guarded, or hesitant. It was real. Warm. Fragile, yet fierce in its honesty. Arun walked forward. Each step felt like crossing 1,000 miles. When he reached her, she whispered, "You came." "I told you," he replied, his voice low but steady. "I'll always come." For a moment, silence stretched between them. The world around faded, the children's laughter, the traffic outside, even the lingering drizzle. It was just them. Meera's hands trembled. She clutched her books tighter. "Arun, I'm afraid," she confessed. "Afraid that if I let myself love you, I'll ruin everything again. That my past will poison what we have." Arun stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "Meera, love isn't about forgetting the past. It's about building something stronger despite it. You're not broken. You're someone who survived. And I don't want a life without you in it." Tears welled in her eyes. She looked away, as if searching for escape. But there was none, not from him, not from her own heart. Finally, she whispered, "What if I can't give you everything? What if I'm never enough?" Arun reached out, gently touching her hand. His voice was steady. "Then give me whatever you can. Because even your half is more than anyone else's whole." Something inside Meera broke then, not in pain, but in release. The walls she had built, brick by brick, over years of fear and loss, began to crumble. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe. She dropped her books. They fell to the damp earth, pages scattering. And before she could lose her courage, she stepped into his arms. Arun held her tightly, as though letting go would undo everything. Her tears soaked into his shirt, but he didn't care. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered against his chest. "But I want to try. With you." Arun closed his eyes, relief flooding through him. "That's all I've ever wanted, Meera. Just a chance to try." From that day, everything did not magically become perfect. There were still shadows in her heart, still moments of doubt. But Arun never rushed her, never demanded more than she could give. He stood by her through it all, patient and steady, like the stars she loved so much. And slowly, Meera began to heal, not because she forgot her scars, but because she finally had someone who loved her with them. Letters turned into calls. Calls turned into shared evenings, stolen laughter, quiet walks by the river. The distance that once defined them faded, replaced by a bond deeper than either had imagined. One evening, as they sat together beneath a starlit sky, Meera whispered, "You waited so long." "Why?" Arun smiled faintly. "Because when the stars remember us, Meera, waiting is nothing." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time, she believed him. Truly believed that maybe love wasn't about perfection or forgetting the past. Maybe it was simply about finding someone who stayed, even when you tried to push them away. And so, when Meera finally chose, it wasn't with grand declarations or promises. It was with a quiet heart, steady and sure. She chose Arun. And this time, she didn't look back. Time, once a cruel distance between them, became their quiet companion. Weeks turned into months, and with each passing day, Meera learned to live not with fear, but with faith. Arun never rushed her. He never demanded confessions or grand gestures. His love was steady, like the rhythm of rain on the roof, like the sunrise that came no matter how dark the night had been. And slowly, the cracks in Meera's heart began to fill. Not with the promise of a life without pain, but with the courage to face it knowing she was no longer alone. One late evening, they sat together on the rooftop of Meera's house in Pune. The city stretched beneath them, lights glowing, cars buzzing, life moving as always. But above, the sky was alive with stars, scattered like diamonds. Meera tilted her head back, her eyes shining. "Do you remember the first night we talked about stars?" she asked softly. Arun smiled. "How could I forget? You said they were the only thing that stayed constant, even when everything else changed." She turned to him, her voice trembling but sure. "I was wrong. They're not the only thing. You stayed too." Arun reached for her hand, threading his fingers with hers. "Always." For a long time, they said nothing more. The silence wasn't heavy now, it was full, like a melody only they could hear. The letters they had once clung to became relics of a different time. Meera kept them in a wooden box by her bed, a reminder of the distance they had crossed. Some evenings, she would open the box and read one aloud, laughing at her own shy words or tearing up at Arun's patient promises. But now, instead of sending words on paper, they built moments in person. Shared meals, arguments over little things, stolen glances in crowded markets, the simple comfort of knowing someone was there when the day ended. Love, Meera realized, wasn't about erasing scars. It was about finding someone who traced them gently, without judgment, and still called them beautiful. Months later, on a rainy night much like the one when their journey had begun, Arun and Meera returned to the railway station where they had first met. The air was damp, the smell of chai mixed with the metallic tang of tracks. Arun glanced around, a small smile tugging at his lips. It feels the same, he murmured. Meera shook her head. No. It feels different. Because now, I'm not waiting alone. They stood there, watching trains rush past, the hum of life all around them. Arun reached into his bag and pulled out a single letter, creased, worn, but carefully kept. He handed it to her. The very first one you wrote to me, he said. I kept it with me, always. Because it reminded me that even when we were apart, you were still with me. Meera's throat tightened as she held the fragile paper. And now, she whispered. Arun smiled gently. Now, I don't need letters to find you. You're here. She blinked away tears and tucked the letter close to her heart. Then let's never go back to being strangers again. Never, Arun promised. That night, as the rain fell around them and the station lights flickered like fading stars, Meera leaned into Arun's arms. For the first time in years, she felt not just hope, but certainty. Her past had not vanished. Her scars had not disappeared. But in Arun's steady presence, she found something greater, peace. The stars above glittered brighter than ever, and Meera whispered, almost to herself, when the stars remember us. I think they'll remember this. Arun kissed her forehead, his voice soft but unshakable. And so will I. Always. And in that moment, their story was no longer about distance or waiting or fear. It was about a choice made freely, a love chosen in spite of everything. A love that would last, not because it was perfect, but because it was real.